untie it.
I swear, I'll end you if I have to, she whispered through trembling lips, but the rancher stood frozen in disbelief, his eyes locked on the broken figure before him. The sun was cruel that day, hanging heavy over the desert like fire poured across the sky. Its heat pressed down until the earth itself seemed ready to crack apart. In the center of that scorched emptiness, a young woman lay stretched out, her wrists tied to iron stakes driven deep into the dirt. Her ankles were bound so tightly the ropes had cut deep into her skin. She looked less like a person and more like an offering left to burn beneath the heavens. Her dress was torn, her lips split from thirst, and strands of hair clung to her damp face. Every shallow breath seemed to take all the strength she had left. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. A circle of villagers stood at a distance, their faces shadowed with judgment. Some turned their eyes away in shame, while others glared coldly, as if her pain proved the righteousness of their fear. At the front of them all stood Henry Boone, the village head. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and his hand rested on the handle of his whip, though he hadn't raised it once. The ropes and the desert sun were punishment enough. "This is the way of our fathers," Boone declared, his voice echoing across the crowd as he pointed toward the young woman. "If she survives 3 days under the sky's gaze, she will walk free. If death claims her, her guilt is proven. That is our law." No one dared to challenge him. The villagers bowed their heads, some muttering prayers under their breath, others spitting into the dust to seal the ritual. Her name was Emily Dawson, just 23 years old, accused of stealing gold from the very people now condemning her. She had denied it again and again, but Boone's word was law. Her voice carried no weight against his. Emily lay helpless, her skin searing under the pitiless sun. Her voice cracked as she tried to plead, "Please, I beg you. I did nothing, please." The desert wind carried her words away. Children buried their faces against their mothers. Old men folded their arms and stood stiff. No one moved. To them, this was not cruelty. This was justice. This was tradition. Questioning it meant standing against the village itself. One by one, they turned away and left her under the burning sky, her body trembling as the hours dragged forward. The ground beneath her blistered her skin. Her vision blurred. The world narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat and the ceaseless buzz of flies crawling across cracked earth. Her lips bled with every word she tried to force out, her voice no stronger than a broken whisper. Yet in the shadow of despair, one thought clung to her. She didn't want to vanish unseen. She didn't want her truth buried in silence. Her cracked lips trembled as she prayed that someone, anyone, might stumble across this cursed patch of land and hear her cry. But who would come? And if they did, would they dare defy Boone? Would they risk standing against the law of their fathers? The sun sank lower, yet the heat still seared her raw skin. Her voice had grown too faint to carry more than a whisper lost in the wind. Emily believed no one would come. And then she heard it, the slow, steady crunch of hooves on brittle soil. Through her blurred vision, she saw him, a tall figure on horseback moving with the cautious steadiness of a man who had seen war. His shoulders were broad, his face marked by time, his eyes sharpened by memories he never spoke of. Daniel Carter, 56, a rancher now, but once a soldier who had walked through fire and carried scars he could never leave behind. He had built his life around silence, work, and the lonely safety of his ranch far from towns and their chaos. But that silence shattered the moment he saw her. A girl staked to the ground, her body raw from rope and sun, her lips cracked and torn from thirst. She lifted her head just enough to whisper through her trembling mouth, "Please, I'm begging you, untie me." The words struck him like a gunshot to the chest. He could have turned his horse and kept riding. It would have been the safer choice. Everyone in these parts knew better than to cross Henry Boone and his laws. But Daniel Carter wasn't made to ride past suffering. Not after what he had seen in the war. Not after the family he had once lost because too many men had chosen to look away. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the cracked earth. He knelt beside Emily, his shadow falling across her burned skin. Her wide eyes searched his face with terror and hope all tangled together. "You're not guilty, are you?" he muttered under his breath. Her answer was no more than a rasp of air. "I swear on my life, I'm not." Daniel drew his knife and sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The cord snapped free, leaving angry red marks across her skin. Her trembling hands lifted as if she couldn't believe she was free. He cut the ties at her ankles and then lifted her easily into his arms. She felt light, too light, as though the desert had already stolen most of her. He carried her toward his horse, but behind them, on the ridge, 2 villagers stood watching. Their eyes were wide with shock, and he knew they would soon run back to Boone. By freeing Emily, Daniel hadn't just broken a law. He had spit in the face of tradition. Emily's voice cracked as he set her on the saddle. "They'll kill you for this." Daniel's jaw tightened as he swung up beside her. "Let them try." With a sharp tug on the reins, the horse started forward, carrying them away from that cursed ground. But just beyond the ridge, danger was already waiting. Daniel guided the horse over the ridge, his arms steadying Emily as she swayed weakly against him. She clutched the saddle horn, her fingers trembling, her head resting against his chest, as though even holding it up was too much. He kept his eyes on the trail, but his ears caught every shallow breath she took. The sound of a voice cut through the wind. "Stop right there, Carter." Daniel pulled the reins, the horse slowing to a halt. He turned his head and saw them. Henry Boone with 4 men standing at his back. Boone's long coat whipped in the dry wind, his hand resting close to the grip of his revolver. His eyes were sharp, but beneath that steel was a flash of something else, anger at being defied. "You think you can ride off with her?" Boone's voice carried across the dry air, heavy with scorn. "You spit on the law of this town, the law of our fathers." Emily's body tensed. Her cracked lips parted, whispering against Daniel's shirt. "They'll kill you." Her voice shook with fear. Daniel kept his eyes on Boone, speaking low but steady. "That law isn't justice, Henry. It's cruelty. And you know she isn't a thief. You just needed someone to blame." Boone's grin stretched, but it carried no warmth. His men spread out, blocking the trail. One carried a heavy stick, another a knife gleaming in the light, the third already gripping a pistol halfway out of its holster. The fourth hung back, his jaw clenched, waiting for Boone's command. Daniel's hand brushed the handle of his old Colt, though he left it in the holster. His pulse stayed steady, the calm of a man who had faced worse than this. The first man charged, swinging the wooden stick. Daniel slid from the saddle in one swift motion, stepping aside as the stick cut through empty air. His fist drove hard into the man's stomach, the sound of breath leaving lungs sharp in the silence. The stick clattered to the ground as the man folded over. The second came fast with a knife. Daniel caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted it hard until the blade dropped into the dust and slammed an elbow into his jaw. The man crumpled, groaning on the ground. Emily gasped when the third man raised his pistol. The shot cracked through the air, wild and high, as Daniel kicked his arm, forcing the gun upward. In the same motion, he drove the man down into the dirt, the revolver skidding across the ground. The last man froze. His eyes darted to Boone for orders, but Boone didn't move. His jaw worked tight, his fingers twitched near his revolver, but he didn't draw. He saw in Daniel's eyes the look of a soldier who had survived battlefields most men never returned from. Boone spit into the dirt. "This isn't finished, Carter. You and the girl will pay. Both of you." His voice was sharp, but there was restraint in it too, a man weighing his pride against his survival. He snapped his hand, motioning for his men. The ones still standing dragged the others up. Beaten, they limped back with pride as broken as their bodies. Boone turned his back, but his words hung heavy. Daniel stood, breathing hard but steady, dust clinging to his shirt, knuckles raw. He climbed back onto the horse, his hand firm around Emily's waist as she clung to him with trembling fingers. Her eyes lifted to his, wide with awe and fear all tangled together. Why risk it?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the empty trail ahead, the desert stretching wide and merciless. Finally, his voice came low. Because I know what it costs when good men walk away. They rode in silence, the horse carrying them past the ridge and into the emptiness beyond. Emily's body leaned against his, too weak to hold herself upright. She closed her eyes, but she wasn't asleep. She was listening to the steady beat of his heart, the only anchor keeping her from drifting into the dark. Every step of the horse felt borrowed, every breath a gamble. Boone had been humiliated, and men like him never forgot. His threats weren't empty. They would come again. Daniel knew it. Emily knew it. And still, they rode on, dust rising behind them, two figures against the endless horizon, bound now by something far greater than law or fear. The town was still when Daniel guided the horse into the sheriff's yard. The air smelled of dust and faint smoke, the kind that clung to wood after a day of heat. Emily slumped against him, half conscious, her weight so light it scared him. Before she slid from the saddle, Daniel caught her, lifting her down as if she were fragile glass. The office door creaked open, and Sheriff Robert Hayes stepped into the light. He stood tall, his hat shading his eyes, one hand resting on his belt. His gaze fell on Daniel, then shifted to the girl in his arms. "Daniel Carter," Hayes said slowly, his voice lined with memory. "I haven't seen you since the war, and now you ride in with a girl ready to collapse. When God's name happened?" Daniel carried Emily inside without answering. He set her gently on a wooden bench, his jaw tight. The sheriff followed, his boots clicking against the floor. When Daniel finally spoke, one name left his lips like a stone dropped in water. "Boone." Hayes' face hardened at once. "That man's been strutting around too long, acting like he owns this land," he muttered. He knelt by Emily, carefully checking her wrists, the rope burns raw and angry against her skin. He shook his head with a grim breath. "She needs water, food, rest. But I believe her." His eyes lifted back to Daniel. "Belief won't be enough. We'll need proof." Daniel didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on Emily, who stirred slightly at the sheriff's touch. Her lips moved, whispering words too faint to catch. Hayes filled a tin cup with water and held it to her mouth. She sipped greedily, trembling as though the act of swallowing was almost too much. "You'll live," Hayes said softly, though he kept his tone steady. "But it'll take time." For the next days, Emily stayed in a small room behind the sheriff's office. Daniel visited often, bringing bread or a tin cup of coffee, watching over her with the quiet steadiness of a man who had once lost too much. At first, she spoke little, her voice hoarse from the desert, but slowly the silence broke. She told him about her parents, about the farm she had worked until Boone's men had come. She told him how the gold went missing, and how she was named the thief without a chance to defend herself. Her voice shook when she spoke, but her eyes carried a stubborn fire. Daniel listened, his weathered face softening in the glow of candlelight. She asked him once about the war. He didn't offer glory, only quiet truths about nights that stretched too long and mornings that came too bitter. Sometimes they shared silence instead. Silences heavy, but not empty. Silences that seemed to say more than words could. One evening, Emily sat across from him at the rough wooden table, her wrists bandaged, her eyes steadier than before. "You could have left me there," she said quietly. "Why didn't you?" Daniel studied her for a long moment, his eyes shadowed but clear. Finally, he answered, "Because no one should die like that, and because I've already lost enough." Her hand, trembling but brave, reached across the table. Her fingers brushed his. It was the briefest touch, yet for Daniel, who had walled himself off for years, it was as if something long buried stirred awake again. But outside, the air in town was growing heavy. Boone's men whispered through taverns and alleys, spreading threats like smoke before a fire. Hayes returned with reports, accounts that didn't add up, traders speaking in low voices about deals Boone had struck in shadows. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a start. Late one night, Daniel stood by the window of the sheriff's office, looking out at the street lamps flickering against the dark. Emily's voice came from behind him, soft but steady. "Do you think we'll ever be free of this, Daniel?" He turned, his face lined with both hope and fear. "I don't know," he said. The silence that followed was heavier than words, because they both knew freedom in this land always came with a price. The days that followed carried a strange weight. The little room behind the sheriff's office became Emily's refuge. Though she often woke in the night drenched in sweat, her body jerking as if the ropes were still biting into her skin. Daniel sometimes sat outside her door, listening to her restless breaths through the thin wall, his own eyes wide open though he pretended to rest. Sheriff Hayes was tireless. Each morning he saddled his horse before the sun had fully risen, riding out to question traders, count goods in the storehouses, and sift through old ledgers coated in dust. Each evening he returned with news, pieces of truth, small but sharp. One night, Hayes placed a stack of papers on the table, his face grim. Shipments meant for neighboring towns never arrived. Ledgers don't balance. Gold disappeared on Boone's watch. It doesn't look good for him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. It's more than not good. It's theft, plain and simple. Hayes rubbed a hand across his face. Maybe, but to bring him down, I need enough evidence to turn his own people against him. They feared him for years. Fear runs deep, Daniel. You know that. Emily listened quietly, her thin hands folded in her lap. The glow from a lantern painted her face in soft light. She still looked fragile, but there was a steadiness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why do they let him do this? Why follow someone they know is cruel?" Hayes met her gaze, his jaw tight. "Because fear can feel safer than fighting back. Most folks would rather bow their heads than risk losing everything." Emily lowered her eyes, her voice little more than a whisper. "That's what they did to me. They turned away, left me there." The room grew still. Daniel's chest tightened as he remembered finding her on the sand, the way her cracked lips had pleaded for mercy. He reached across the table, laying his rough hand over hers. Her small fingers trembled, then still beneath his. "You're not alone now," he said. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was something more than fear in her eyes. Something fragile but alive, trust. Outside, the town's air grew sharper. Boone's men were everywhere, leaning in doorways, lurking near saloons, their eyes hunting for whispers. They spread rumors that Daniel had bewitched the girl, that Hayes was siding against the people, that Boone alone kept order. The lies spread, but so did doubt. Folks began to talk in hushed voices. Some shook their heads, no longer sure where the truth lay. One evening, Hayes returned late, dust thick on his coat. He dropped a torn ledger onto the table, his voice heavy. "This is it. Records show gold meant for trade vanished straight into Boone's hands. And traders have begun to speak. They're tired of being cheated." Daniel's eyes flicked to Emily, who sat silent, her hand gripping the edge of the bench. He could see her chest rise and fall with quick breaths. For her, this wasn't just news. It was her life being given back piece by piece. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "If the people see it, if they know the truth, maybe they'll believe I was innocent." Daniel's heart ached at the word innocent. A young woman, forced to fight for something that should never have been in question. He reached for her again, this time more certain, and held her hand in his. "You never had to prove that to me," he said. Emily's lips curved into the smallest smile, faint but real. She squeezed his hand, then pulled away gently, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Later that night, after Hayes had gone, Daniel found her standing by the window, the lamplight casting her shadow long across the floor. She was staring at the dark street outside. "They'll come for us, won't they?" she asked without turning. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Yes. Boone won't let this go." Her shoulders stiffened. "Then what happens? If he doesn't kill me, he'll kill you." Daniel stood beside her, watching the street. "I've lived a long time with ghosts, Emily. I'm not afraid of him. What I won't stand for is letting you pay for his sins." She looked at him, then really looked. His face was lined, his eyes tired, but there was something fierce in them too, a kind of strength she hadn't seen in anyone else. Slowly, she nodded. That night she slept better than before. Daniel sat by the door again, his back against the wall, his hat tipped low. But for the first time in years, He let himself believe that maybe he wasn't just fighting ghosts anymore. Maybe he was fighting for something alive. And yet, in the silence between heartbeats, he knew the storm was coming. Boone would not let humiliation stand. And when he struck, it would be with everything he had left. Morning came heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin before the sun was even high. Sheriff Hayes saddled his horse with the weight of a man who knew the day would change everything. Daniel rode beside him, Emily seated on the horse behind, her arms looped gently around his waist. She was still weak, but she insisted on coming. "They need to see me," she had said the night before, her voice trembling but determined. "They need to look me in the eye and know what they did." Daniel had argued, but in the end he couldn't deny her. This was her fight as much as anyone's. By mid-morning, the three of them rode into the heart of the village. People spilled from homes and shops, their faces tense, voices hushed. Fear lingered in the air, but curiosity stirred with it. Sheriff Hayes dismounted, holding a stack of ledgers and notes in his hand. Henry Boone stood near the well, his men gathered close, their eyes sharp as knives. Boone's long coat hung heavy around him, his hand never far from the grip of his revolver. His grin was stretched thin, more a snarl than a smile, but his voice carried loud enough for all. "Well, well." The sheriff himself, and Carter. And look, his eyes slid to Emily, his tone laced with contempt, the little thief who thinks she can play the victim. Emily's hand tightened on the saddle horn, but Daniel felt her steady herself. She didn't look away. Hayes stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. "Enough lies, Boone. How about the records? Shipments of gold gone missing. Traders cheated. Numbers twisted until they don't make sense. And every line of it points back to you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, eager for the truth. Boone barked a laugh. "Forged. All of it. You expect these people to believe scraps of paper over the word of their leader? Over tradition?" He spread his arms wide, calling the crowd to him. "I've kept you fed. I've kept outsiders from bleeding you dry. And now this man rides in with his war buddy and a girl who'd steal the coins from your pockets. And you believe them?" For years, those words would have been enough. Fear would have sealed their lips, and silence would have followed. But now the proof was there, laid bare in the sheriff's hands. Hayes lifted the ledgers high. "These aren't just numbers. Traders have spoken. Gold meant for this town never reached its buyers. Ask yourselves, where did it go? Who has lived richer while the rest of you struggle?" The crowd shifted, voices growing louder, angrier. A woman's voice rang out from the back, sharp with fury. "My boy went hungry while you lined your pockets, Boone." Another man shouted, "I work your storehouse and never saw half the shipments that were promised." The tide was turning, and Boone felt it. His jaw tightened, his hand resting harder against his revolver. He sneered at Emily, his voice sharp. "And you dare show your face here after the disgrace you brought?" Emily's voice wavered, but she didn't back down. "The disgrace wasn't mine. It was yours. You left me to die for a crime you committed. And she turned her eyes toward the villagers. They turned their backs. But you can't hide the truth anymore." The silence that followed was thick. Dozens of eyes turned toward Boone, not with fear this time, but with something sharper, anger. A man stepped forward, old and stooped, but his voice cut like a blade. "If the sun is our judge, let it judge you, Boone." The words spread like fire through the crowd. "Yes," another shouted. "Let him face the same trial." Boone's face blanched beneath the dirt and sweat. He drew his revolver half out of its holster, but Daniel's hand was already hovering near his Colt. Their eyes locked, a silent warning passing between them. Boone's grip faltered. The crowd surged. Men and women who had once bowed their heads now stepped forward, their hands pulling ropes, iron stakes dragged from the very place Emily had suffered. Boone fought, shouting curses, but the weight of the people was heavier than any law he had written. They bound him to the ground, ropes cutting into his wrists and ankles, the sun glaring down from above. For the first time, Boone's sharp eyes flickered with fear. Emily stood behind Daniel, trembling as she watched. "It's cruel," she whispered. Daniel laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes, but sometimes a cruel law devours the man who made it. The villagers stepped back, leaving Boone alone under the merciless sky. His shouts echoed, but no one listened. Justice, twisted for so long, had turned full circle. Sheriff Hayes exhaled, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it all. He looked to Emily, then to Daniel. "You're free now, both of you. But freedom out here, it always comes with a price." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving Boone's struggling figure on the ground. He knew the sheriff was right, and as the crowd dispersed, the desert seemed to breathe again, as if even the land had waited for this day. The dust of the village still clung to Daniel's boots when he led Emily out that evening. The sun was sinking low, bleeding red across the horizon, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke from cook fires. The people who had once turned away from Emily now avoided her eyes, too ashamed to face what they had done. Some whispered apologies under their breath, but most stayed silent, pretending they had nothing to atone for. Daniel felt the weight of their stares, but Emily seemed to feel it more. She walked close to him, her steps unsteady, her arms wrapped around herself as if the shame of others pressed against her skin. He wished he could shield her from it, but he knew words wouldn't take away what had been done. They reached the sheriff's office, where Hayes waited on the porch with a weary look. His eyes softened at the sight of Emily, though his jaw stayed hard. "I reckon you'll want to leave this town behind," he said. "You've both made enemies here, and while Boone's tied to the dirt, his shadow won't fade so quick." Daniel nodded. "You're right. We'll ride out at first light." Emily looked between the two men, her voice small. "Where will we go?" Daniel hesitated. His ranch lay miles west, quiet and lonely, the kind of place where he'd chosen silence over company. He hadn't planned on sharing it with anyone again. But as he looked at her, this young woman who had been left to die under the sun, who now stood trembling but unbroken, he realized the ranch might not need to stay empty. "My place isn't much," he said slowly, his voice gruff. "But it's safe. If you want it, it's yours too." Emily's lips parted in surprise, her eyes wet. She nodded quickly, as if afraid he might take the offer back. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, they stayed in the sheriff's spare room. Daniel kept watch near the door, his rifle across his lap. He barely slept, listening to Emily's soft breath from the cot across the room. Every so often she stirred, whimpering in her sleep, her fingers twitching as if she were still bound. Daniel wanted to wake her, to tell her she was safe, but he knew the wounds ran deeper than any words could reach. At dawn, they saddled the horse. Hayes gripped Daniel's hand before they left. "I'll hold the town together best I can. You watch over her." Daniel's eyes met his steady. "Always." The ride west was long and quiet. The land stretched wide, hills rolling into endless plains, the silence broken only by the clop of hooves. Emily leaned against him, her body still weak, but her eyes stayed open, watching the horizon as though trying to believe it was real. Hours later, they reached the ranch. The house was small, weathered by years of storms, its wooden beams dark with age. The corral stood empty, the barn half open, swaying slightly in the wind. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and for Daniel, it had always been enough. He helped her down from the horse, his hands gentle at her waist. She looked at the ranch, then at him, her expression unreadable. "This is home," he nodded. "Has been for years." Her eyes softened. "It feels quiet." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "That's the idea." Inside, he lit the lantern, its glow spilling across the worn wooden table and the old rocking chair by the hearth. Emily ran her fingers along the surface of the table, pausing at the deep scratches etched into the wood. She traced them silently, as though trying to imagine the life that had left those marks. "Your family?" she asked softly. Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "Once, long time ago." Her eyes lingered on him, but she didn't press. She only nodded, and in that small act of restraint, Daniel felt something shift between them. She understood loss, and she knew some stories were better left waiting. Days turned into weeks. Emily grew stronger, her color returning, her laughter appearing in small, fragile bursts. She helped mend fences, carried buckets of water from the well, and sometimes hummed softly while she worked, her voice thin but beautiful. At night, they sat by the fire, sharing coffee from tin mugs. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Silence wasn't empty anymore. It was something they carried together. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. Daniel often caught Emily staring at the horizon, her brow furrowed, her shoulders tense. Boone's threats still hung in the air, his words echoing. "This isn't finished. You'll pay." One evening, as the fire crackled low, Emily spoke without looking at him. "Do you think he'll come back?" Daniel's eyes stayed on the flames. "Men like him don't forgive. But if he does come, he'll have to go through me." She turned her head, studying him with quiet intensity. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You already gave me back my life. Don't lose yours because of me." Daniel looked at her then, his weathered face softening. "Life isn't worth much if you don't fight for something. I won't stand by while someone tries to take yours again." Her eyes filled, and for a moment she couldn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand across the table, holding it with a strength that surprised him. In that quiet, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: hope. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. And though the shadow of Boone still stretched long over the plains, Daniel knew they had begun something worth protecting. The ranch grew quieter with each passing day. Emily began to smile more, though it was often small and fleeting, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She moved with more strength, carrying buckets from the well, helping in the kitchen, even sweeping the porch with a steady rhythm. Daniel watched her sometimes from the corral, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. She was alive, and with every step she took, she was reclaiming herself. But peace never lasted long in the West. One late afternoon, as the sun slid low and painted the sky in gold, Daniel spotted dust on the horizon. His stomach turned heavy. He knew what it meant before he even counted the riders. For men, moving fast. He stepped onto the porch, his rifle leaning against the wall. Emily was near the barn, her hands full of laundry she had hung to dry. She noticed his face first, then turned her eyes to the horizon. Her lips parted, the color draining from her cheeks. "They've come," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. Inside, Emily. She didn't argue. She hurried to the door, glancing back at him with fear sharp in her eyes. But she trusted him. That mattered more than words. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. Their horses pawed the dirt, snorting in the heat. The men were rough-looking, their eyes cold. Boone wasn't with them, but Daniel knew they carried his message. One man leaned forward in the saddle, his hand resting near his pistol. "Carter," he called out, "you've got something that don't belong to you. The girl comes back with us." "Boone's orders." Daniel stood still, his voice low but firm. "Tell Boone if he wants her, he can come himself. But he won't leave standing." The men shifted in their saddles. One spat into the dust. Another smirked, flashing yellowed teeth. "We ain't here to talk. We're here to collect." Daniel's hand brushed the butt of his Colt. His heart was steady, the same calm he had felt in war. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was his home, and inside that house was someone worth more to him than his own skin. The first rider swung down, stomping toward the porch with heavy boots. "Last chance, old man. Move aside." Daniel's jaw tightened. His voice was cold. "Not today." The man reached for his gun, but Daniel's Colt was already out. A single shot cracked through the air, sharp and final. The rider fell hard, his pistol still in its holster. The others drew quick, the sound of metal against leather echoing in the still air. Shots rang out. Dust flew. The ranch shuddered with violence. Emily cried out from inside, ducking to the floor as bullets splintered the doorframe. Daniel fired again, his aim steady. One rider spun backward off his horse, hitting the ground with a thud. The others pulled back, their eyes wide at the sudden loss. "You'll pay for this, Carter," one shouted, yanking his reins. They wheeled their horses around, retreating into the open land, leaving their dead behind. Silence followed, broken only by the crackling of wood where a bullet had torn the porch beam. Daniel lowered his Colt slowly, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He turned toward the door, pushing it open. Emily sat against the wall, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with fear. When she saw him, relief washed over her face, and tears spilled without her trying to stop them. "You're alive," she breathed, her voice trembling. He crouched beside her, his rough hand brushing her hair back from her face. "So are you." She clung to him then, her body shaking against his chest. Daniel held her close, his arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that seemed out of place in a man who had just taken lives. "They won't stop," she whispered into his shirt. Daniel closed his eyes. He could feel her heartbeat racing, and he knew she was right. Boone wouldn't forgive, not after this. This fight wasn't finished. But he also knew something else. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, he had someone to fight for, someone who gave meaning to the scars he carried. "We'll face him when he comes," Daniel said softly. Together, Emily pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were wet, but there was a new strength in them. She nodded. Together, outside, the land stretched wide and silent, but Daniel could feel the storm building again. Boone's men would return. Boone himself would return. And when he did, there would be no running. The desert didn't forgive, but maybe, just maybe, it gave second chances to those willing to fight for them. The night before Boone came, the air felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. The ranch was quiet, the only sound the slow creak of the windmill turning against the dark sky. Emily couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, her knees pulled close, staring at the flames as if they might give her courage. Daniel sat across from her, polishing his Colt with slow, steady hands. His face was calm, but his eyes were far away, as if he were already seeing the fight to come. Finally, Emily spoke. "He's coming, isn't he?" Daniel nodded once. "He won't stop until he's standing here. Men like Boone don't know how to let go." Her voice cracked. "And what if he wins?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes softening. "He won't. Not because I'm stronger, but because I've got something he never had." Emily frowned. "What's that?" He leaned forward, his voice low. "A reason to stand." Her eyes welled, but she didn't argue. She just reached across the table, her hand finding his, holding it tightly until the fire burned low. Morning came with dust on the horizon. This time, Boone himself rode at the front, his coat flapping like a shadow behind him. A dozen men followed, rifles slung, faces hard. Daniel stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, Emily behind him. She wanted to hide, but she refused. She had been left to die once. She wouldn't face the world with her head bowed again. Boone pulled his horse to a stop, his voice sharp. "Carter, you've taken what's mine. Hand over the girl, and maybe I'll let you crawl away with your life." Daniel's voice carried steady across the yard. "She's not yours, Boone. She never was. And your law, your fear, it ends today." Boone sneered, drawing his revolver. His men fanned out, circling like wolves. Daniel raised his rifle, the weight familiar, his fingers steady on the trigger. The first shot cracked, the sound rolling across the plains. Then chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air, dirt exploding at their feet, glass shattering from the windows. Daniel moved with calm precision, each shot deliberate, each breath steady. Two of Boone's men fell before they reached the barn. Emily crouched low behind the porch railing, clutching a pistol Daniel had pressed into her hand. Her fingers shook, but when one rider charged toward the house, she lifted it and fired. The man fell hard, his horse bolting into the dust. Her chest heaved, but she didn't crumble. She wasn't prey anymore. The fight raged, until at last it was only Boone left, standing in the open yard, his revolver raised, his face twisted with rage. Dust clung to his sweat, his eyes burning with hate. "You should have stayed out of this, Carter," Boone spat. "I gave you a chance. Now you'll die for her." Daniel lowered his rifle slowly, letting it hang at his side. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying. "No, Boone. I'll live for her. That's the difference." Boone roared, lifting his gun, but Daniel was faster. His Colt flashed, the shot ringing out sharp and final. Boone staggered, his revolver slipping from his fingers before he collapsed into the dust he had once ruled. The yard fell silent. The echo of gunfire drifted away into the wide desert, leaving only the sound of wind through dry grass. Boone lay still, his shadow finally gone. Daniel stood, breathing hard, his Colt smoking in his hand. Emily rushed to him, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She gripped his arm, searching his face as though to be sure he was real. "It's over," she whispered. Daniel looked down at her, his jaw tight, then slowly nodded. "It's over." They buried the dead at the edge of the land. Boone's men who had fallen were laid in simple graves, while Boone himself was left in the dust, unmarked. The townsfolk came days later, some silent, some ashamed, but all of them free from his grip at last. That evening, Daniel and Emily sat on the porch, watching the sky burn orange and gold. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes finally calm. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Daniel looked out at the horizon, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Now we live. Not just survive. Live." She closed her eyes, letting the words settle. For the first time, she believed it. And so the desert, cruel and unforgiving, had given them something rare. Not just freedom, but the chance to begin again. The lesson was clear, written in every scar, every tear, every breath they had fought to keep. Cruelty can rule for a time, but truth and courage will always outlast it. Fear chains people, but one person's stand can break those chains for everyone. And love, even in the harshest places, can grow where no one expects it.